A serpentine belt break-in can cause catastrophic engine damage, but no worries. Today on Tech Garage, we're going to take you through accessory belt drive systems and timing belts. And we're going to take a look at some hoses so this doesn't happen to you. See you back at the garage as soon as I get a hold of a rollback. Welcome to Tech Garage, presented by Advance Auto Parts. Today it's all about belts, belts, and more belts. We're talking timing belts, and then we're going to look at the serpentine drive belt. And a little later, we'll look at some lines and hoses so you don't end up on the side of the road like I did. Before we go into belts, though, we have to understand that cars have become very sophisticated, and the technology that goes into them evolved into the belts. And we'll go through the history of belts. This first one I have right here, this is a V drive belt. This could drive several pulleys, but it's just in one V groove. It's kind of an older style belt. Then they went to what's called neoprene belts. Now this belt here, this belt is actually a serpentine drive belt, but it's in neoprene in construction. So you can bend this one and see the cracks. Now the next one, this is a EPDM belt. Now this is some new technology. These belts last a lot longer, and we'll see a little bit later there's some special methods we need to use when we check this belt. And you can see I have a demo right here, and this is how the belt works. The serpentine belt all starts right down here in the crankshaft, and the crankshaft pulls the belt, and when it pulls the belt, it's going to run it through several. It may have an idler pulley. You can come up here, it may be driving an alternator, and then it comes around here and drives a water pump. And then it goes over to the power steering, and if you have air conditioner, it may even drive that. So if your belt pops off like mine did, you're not driving a water pump, catastrophic engine failure. You're not charging with the alternator, or I don't know which is worse, no AC. But it's an important piece of the puzzle. Now here's the deal right here. This is a tensioner. Now this tensioner here does two functions. It holds constant tension on the belt, sits right there, and it also absorbs any oscillations. Well, if the crankshaft's sputtering or you turn on your air conditioner, it wants to oscillate a little bit, this will take care of that. Well, there's all the basics about belts, but we need to look at it in action over on the pickup truck. Well, the rollback got us in the shop, but before we put our belt on, we need to go ahead and make some checks. We have to make sure that none of the pulleys are out of line or find out the reason why the belt broke. First thing we can do is come down to the crankshaft. Now on this truck, it's down here. Just look at the pulley, make sure there's no debris in it, wiggle it back and forth. Same thing with the water pump. Now water pumps, the bearings go out in the front and this pulley could wiggle and that could cause the belt to come off. Come over here to my accessory drive belt, my tensioner, make sure it's all in good shape, pull it back and forth, idler pulley right here, and then it goes down to a power steering pump. Same thing, just spin it, feel it, make sure the bearings are all good, everything's in line, and then you come up to your alternator. Now if you have an alternator, you may have a decoupler pulley. Now the decoupler pulley helps with some of the belt oscillations. If you have an alternator with a decoupler pulley, you have to replace it with the same one. You can't change it because it's an integral part of the system. Once you do that, you're about ready to put the belt back on. But before we do that, one more tip I want to share with you. If you have some noise in the accessory belt drive system or in the front end of the car, you can remove the belt for a minute. Remember, it drives the water pump and a few things. Crank it up. If the noise goes away, well, then you know it's probably in the accessory belt drive system. If the noise is still there, it's in the timing system. Timing belt, timing chain, we'll look at that a little later. We're ready to put our belt back on, but the first thing you need to do is get a belt routing diagram. We have ours on MotoLogic here. Professional techs use this. If you're just taking a belt off, take a picture or look in your vehicle manual to find your routing diagram. We'll start out down at the crankshaft. I'm going to come down to the crankshaft. I'm going to run it around the crankshaft. Now every car is a little bit different, so you're going to have to work with this. Then I come over to the water pump, and if I look over there, I'm coming to the power steering pump. I'm going to go ahead and put it around the power steering pump, try to hold tension on it so it doesn't slip off the other pulleys. Then I can go around the alternator. Now, I like to go on a smooth back pulley last because that gives me a little leverage. Once I do that, I can come all the way over here to the tensioner, put it on the tensioner, and then I can push down, hold tension on it. Well, it's not going to go on now, but I'm going to use a serpentine tension tool. I can go over here, I can grab the tensioner, and when I grab the tensioner, I'm going to push down, and what that does, it gives me the slack to go ahead and put the belt on. So if I push it down all the way, I can slip the belt right on and release it. Now, very important that you go back and make sure that it's in all the grooves, look at your routing diagram, make sure it's all right. And then crank up the truck and give it a test. Look at it. Look at your pulleys. Make sure everything's in line. Make sure everything's going smooth. Once your belt's back on, you're ready to move on. You know, we'll be right back with the email question of the week from Brian when we return with more Tech Garage presented by Advance Auto Parts.
This edition of Tech Garage, presented by Advance Auto Parts, is being brought to you by Dayco Products, keeping you moving since 1905. ARP, the world leader in fastener technology. Steel Rubber, quality crafted rubber parts and weather stripping. And by Advance Auto Parts, let's get you back to the garage. And now the email question of the week, presented by Advance Auto Parts.
John, we've got an email question here from Austin in Hartford, Connecticut. He's got a serpentine belt that was squealing intermittently. He replaced the belt and it still squeals, but mostly in the morning. He was told not to spray belt dressing on that new belt, but he wants the squealing to stop. Any advice for him?
Brian, Austin's question is a common complaint. Belt squeal happens all the time, and I know belt dressing is not a good idea with the new technology that's involved in these belts. But we brought in an expert to tell us more. Robert Christie from Dayco. I'm glad you're here. What can you share about belt dressing?
Well, you're exactly right, John. Belt dressing with today's EPDM belts, they may mask the problem for the short term, but what it does is the EPDM absorbs those oils and causes the ribs to swell. So when it returns, it's even worse.
Now, you can use that on some older belts. You said EPDM, we checked them earlier, versus the old neoprene belts?
Yes, the neoprene belts were less resistant to oil, or absorbent to oil, I should say, than the EPDM.
Now, water spray test. I know we can run the engine, spray it. What's that going to tell us?
Well, it's a simple trick when you have belt noise, and that's the most common complaint. The number one cause for belt noise is misalignment. The second would be tension. So when you spray the rib side of the belt while the vehicle is running, and if the noise goes away, that's a misalignment. If the noise gets louder, then that's a tension issue.
So you'd have to fix that with a tensioner. I see you got a tensioner there?
Mm-hmm. Yes, a lot of times when you're replacing the serpentine belt, you always want to replace the tensioner too, because these belts are being replaced anywhere above 85,000 miles. This is a spring inside this tensioner, and it also is a wear item.
Now the EPDM belts, there's a wearness gauge, there's a way to check it. Can you demonstrate that?
Right. Absolutely. Today's belts wear a little bit differently. The old neoprene belts, as you were talking about before, they tend to crack. So it was easy to identify a worn belt. You look under a hood, and if it had 4 cracks between this 1-inch window, you replace the belt. Well, today's belts wear a little bit differently. The V that it starts with wears out, and that V kind of turns into a U. So you use a depth gauge, very similar to this. This is a new belt, where when you put the gauge on it, you could still feel the plastic. This is somewhat aged belt. You still feel it, although it's getting a little aged. This right here, although it looks very good, it's not cracked or anything, is a worn belt. When you put the gauge in here, you can feel the plastic, therefore it's worn. You could also use, on this Dayco gauge, the crown, and you put this in here, and you could wiggle it side to side. Therefore, when it has movement like that, that means that V is turned into a U and it's worn.
It starts to wear out. It's going to introduce a lot of heat into these components.
Certainly, it's going to start slipping, and introduce heat to the components, make some noise.
Wow. And can you pick up that tool anywhere, or where do we get that?
Yes, you can get these at any auto parts store that distributes Dayco products. They'll give these to you for free. Go out in the parking lot and check your belt.
Now, I know your belt's a little bit different. What about that W groove?
Yeah, you see, when we introduced EPDM belts about 10 years ago, the number one issue is when you're replacing these belts on vehicles, John, they're not perfect. They're nearly 100,000 miles. So you're putting a very stiffer belt, and EPDM rubber is very stiff. You're putting it on a vehicle at 100,000 miles. It's not perfect. So then these slight little misalignments presented themselves as noise. So the Dayco engineers came up with a unique solution to help with slight misalignments. And what they did is they cut a notch in the middle of the rib and allowed that rib to conform a little bit to these slight misalignments on these high mileage vehicles, causing the belt to run very quiet.
Now, alignment, we can actually address that too. I know you got a tool right here. If you help me, you pull that tensioner. Let's get this belt right off of here. See if we can pop this belt off. All right, we'll get that belt off. Yep. Now this alignment tool, There's a few things in here. I know there's a laser alignment, receiver and stuff.
Sure.
Demonstrate that for us.
Well, the Dayco laser tool is a little bit different than some of the other laser tools because it has a linear laser. What that does is allows you to measure misalignment and also angular misalignment. So if the pulley is pressed on or off in the wrong spot, you can see it with the line. And if the bearing is worn and it's causing angular misalignment, you'll see that as well. Oh. So you can run this throughout the whole system as the laser hits all the items, and you can see if you are in alignment or not.
So the water test, if it's out of alignment, this is a good tool to use.
To find out which component is out of alignment.
Yeah, and I know when we push power steering pumps on and off, that alignment is critical, especially for the belt.
That's a very good tip because most of the time it's the power steering pumps that are pressed on and off or come out of alignment.
That'll do it, yeah. Well, that's a good look at belts. You know, this should help out Austin's problem. There's all kinds of checks you can make. This is important. Now we're good with the accessory belt drive. Let's look at our attention to timing belts. And we'll do that when we return with more Tech Garage presented by Advance Auto Parts.
How can a serpentine belt damage your vehicle's accessories? A. Belt too tight. B. Belt too loose. C. Belt replaced too often. Or D. Belt too long. The correct answer is A. A serpentine belt that is tensioned too tight will put strain on the pulleys, inducing heat into the components, causing premature failure.
Welcome back to Tech Garage, presented by Advance Auto Parts. Now we're good with the accessory belt drive system. Let's turn our attention to the timing system. And I got one right here to show you. The timing system starts down here at the crankshaft. Now the crankshaft drives the timing belt and it goes up here through a tensioner. This one's a hydraulic tensioner. You may have a manual tensioner, and then it comes up and it goes over the camshaft. Now the camshaft is the big pulley, but it's because it turns half the speed of the crankshaft. And then it comes down here and it goes through an idler pulley, and then you see here it actually drives a water pump. Now think about that for a minute. It drives a water pump. So if your water pump's leaking, it could get on the belt, you could have problems. One other thing, you know, this is a difficult job. You have to tear the whole front of the engine down in order to get to this timing belt, so you can get you a kit like this. I highly recommend that you go ahead and get a water pump and timing belt, whether you need one or not, because over time your water pump's going to fail and it's going to start to leak. And if it leaks on the belt, it may jump one or two teeth. You could end up with catastrophic engine damage. Got a few engines over here to show you how it's actually configured. This one right here is a single overhead cam engine. Once again, down at the crankshaft, this is a manual little adjuster right here. It comes up through one camshaft, comes all the way over to the other camshaft, and then it goes down back to the crank pulley. Now this one's a little unique. And why this one's a little unique? Because this one's a dual overhead cam. But not only that, this is a 3.4 liter, and it employs an actual chain down here that drives the intermediate shaft that drives the timing belt. And you can see it here. This is the intermediate shaft. Then the timing belt comes up and it comes through the tensioner. The tensioner is located right here. Then it goes through two camshafts. This one right here is the exhaust camshaft, and then the intake camshaft. Comes over a little idler pulley to the intake and then over to the exhaust camshaft. Rides back to an idler pulley and back to the intermediate shaft. Now, that's a good look at timing belts, but we need to get you out in the garage and show you how to do one, and we're going to do that next. Let's take a look at a timing belt in action. Now, what does a timing belt do? Well, it creates a choreographed dance between the camshaft, the valves, and the piston. And I can show it to you right here in our trainer. What's happening is the timing belt's going around, and when the timing belt's going around, hence the name timing, it's keeping the engine in time, the camshaft to the crankshaft. And you can see the piston's going up and down, and the valves are all moving at the right time. The intake's opening, the exhaust's opening, and everything's going just as it should go. Now, I want to talk about two types of engines. There's an interference engine, and an interference engine is where the valve will hit the piston if it's not in time. And there's a freewheeling engine, which it wouldn't matter. The valves have enough clearance. But if you have an interference engine, and most of us do on today's cars, you got to be careful, because you may be running at 3,000 RPM and that timing belt breaks. That's going to be catastrophic damage. Now, what I'm going to do, I don't recommend you do at home, but I want to show it to you. I'm just going to reach over here, and I'm going to cut this timing belt clean off this motor. Well, what happened? Just took it out of time. So what's going to happen is the piston comes up, one of these valves may be open. So what's going to go on is the piston comes up, if this valve was in the open position, whammo, it's going to hit the piston. Once it hits the piston, something has to give. The valve's gonna bend, the rod's gonna bend, something's gonna break. And you may end up with something like this. This actually broke the timing belt and the valve was stuck in the piston. Well, we cut that belt, so we need to head over and time this engine. Well, because we cut the belt off, we need to retime this engine. But before we do, I'll show you a few components that the timing belt runs. Down here is the crankshaft, and then the crankshaft, it comes up here to the water pump. Well, we said earlier, it may drive the water pump. On this model, it does. All the work taking all these components off the front, go ahead and change the water pump out while you're down there. Then you come up here through a tensioner. This is a manual tensioner, and then it comes up and it drives the actual camshaft right here. But before we put our belt on, we need to do a couple things. The first thing I want to do is loosen up the tensioner. Remember, we cut our belt off, so we need to get that loose where we can put the belt on. Then I'm going to come down here, and I already put the crankshaft in time. You see these two marks right here? The crankshaft has to be in time with the camshaft. So I'm going to take my belt, I'm going to work it on the crankshaft first. Once I get it in the crankshaft, make sure it's in the teeth of the crankshaft, and also make sure you look at your tooth. Some are round, some are square. Make sure they match the pulleys. Come over to the water pump. I'll get it on the water pump, and then I'm going to come around the tensioner. But before I time the camshaft, I have to make sure that these marks are in order. Check your service manual, find some information to find out where these timing marks are, because we talked about that choreographed dance between the piston and the valves, the camshaft and the crankshaft. This is what's causing it. I come around here and then just slip it on, make sure it stays, make sure your marks are in order. Then you want to come over, put a little tension on it, and go ahead and tighten up your tensioner. Now, the most important thing you can do after you get it on there is turn the engine over by hand. Turn it over at least 720 degrees, 4-stroke cycle. Because you're turning it over by hand, you have no chance of bending the valves. If all of a sudden it stops, it's out of time. You're hitting one of those valves. Well, we got timing systems down, we got belts down. We're going to go ahead and look at some lines and hoses as soon as we come back with more Tech Garage presented by Advance Auto Parts.
This edition of Tech Garage, presented by Advance Auto Parts, is being brought to you by Dayco Products, keeping you moving since 1905. Custom Auto Sound, the originator of classic car OEM fit radios since 1977. Low-Car, quality plain and simple. And by Advance Auto Parts, let's get you back to the garage.
Welcome back to Tech Garage. Now, we understand the catastrophic damage that the belts could cause. Let's turn our attention to the lines and hoses. Now, under the hood, there's a whole ton of lines and hoses, and we'll start right over here. You know, you got some brake lines. You could have vacuum hoses going to the brake booster, or vacuum hoses going all over the vehicle. Come up here, you got some evaporative emission lines that go in. You got some fuel lines, some steel fuel lines. There's AC lines. There's radiator hoses, there's all kinds of things. Now the radiator hoses, you know, they can deteriorate right on the inside. I got one here that's all cut up. You can see it's not too good on the inside. They start deteriorating. You can run a pressure test. Now a pressure test, just put this on the radiator, pump it up, and look at the pressure. If the pressure starts to drop, you have a leak. It'll pump up the pressure in the hoses, check your clamps, make sure everything's in order. All the hoses and lines that we looked at up under the hood, I have laid out here on the table so we can share some tips and tricks about each one of them. The first one I want to look at is the fuel line. Now my fuel line comes in here, a steel line, and then attaches to a flexible line. They couple in two different ways. You could have a spring lock connector right here. You have to put it on. Or on this case, you have this tool right here you need to put over the line, push it in, and when you push it in, it releases these springs inside of here. When it releases the springs, it allows it to come off this little coupler here, and you can remove the line. Without this tool, you're not going to get this one off the line. Now right here, you can see it's flexible line. This is special line also. It's right here, it's plastic. You may have to get a kit to put the line together, to put everything in order, or you may have to go ahead and get the whole component now that comes with the lines right on it. These are the quick disconnects right there on it, and don't forget to hook up your ground wire too. Now we'll turn our attention to the brakes. Brake lines come in all shapes and sizes also. This one is a double flare. Now the double flare comes out and flares on itself, and this one here is called a bubble flare or an ISO flare. They're different, and where they go in are different, so you have to get the right lines. You can't put compression fittings in there, and you have to get the right length, so you may need to get a bender here. What you do is you put the line in, the tube across, and then you bend it to where it needs to be, measure it, cut it, flare it, put it on the vehicle. Couple of kits, double flare kit. This is for the double flare. This is the cutter for the line, and then right here is an ISO or the bubble flare kit. You're gonna need that to make the ends. Another tip, while you're doing the brake lines, make sure you use a line wrench to get these off. They're aluminum, some of them. You don't want to over tighten them into the master cylinder. A line wrench is a really, really good idea. Coming over to my air conditioner. Now my air conditioner, these are aluminum lines also, and you can see actually have an O-ring. The O-ring's located right here. Now, whether you're using PAG oil or mineral oil, that O-ring needs to be lubricated, and if that O-ring's leaking, you're gonna lose your Freon out, and you're gonna have to recharge your air conditioning. So these lines need attention too. Make sure you don't over tighten these because these are aluminum. Check your torque specifications. Now we can also turn our attention to the radiator. There's a few tricks with that too. You've probably seen these clamps before. Well, these clamps are hard to get off and sometimes in an awkward position. So I got these pliers right here, and these pliers actually go on this clamp and they lock on. So I can grab that and I can go ahead and pull it down. And when I pull it down, I can get the line off. I may want to cut the line, or I can go ahead and just pull it off. Now, I learned a racer's trick from Dave Bowman years ago. Get you some hand cleaner, put it on there, you can slip the line right back on the car. All this is some really good information. And you know what? You can get out to the garage now and check out your car to avoid any catastrophic engine damage. We're out of time for today. So from our garage to your garage, thanks for watching Tech Garage, presented by Advance Auto Parts.